However, there have been a certain percentage of this volume of reports that have been made by credible observers of relatively incredible things. It is this group of observations that we now are attempting to resolve.
Nathan Twining was a general in the United States Air Force, and he came out with a statement that these objects are real, they are not fictitious. That within itself really tells you that the U.S. government at that point in time considered the UFO phenomenon as a real concern for the nation as a whole. Swamp gas has become a statement of lore in our society now, right? You say something was swamp gas, then you know you're saying it's something that's not real. This object was picked up on radar. It came onto the base. It was seen by 2 Air Force enlisted men on the base. They described it as a football-shaped object that was spinning, just hovering right above the ground.
Welcome to UFO Radio-International, investigative podcast show about UFO phenomena. And here is your host, Juliana Marinkovic.
And yes, it is time to start our 5th episode. For the beginning, I would like to thank everyone who showed considerable interest for our previous episode, which was a special show, investigation of the radar visual UFO incident above New Zealand from 1970s, when we had Peter Marr, a former NAC pilot, as a guest. Feel free to check that episode if you missed it. And today, another episode where we will delve deep into the history of the phenomena. I'm happy to announce that today's guest will be Robert Powell from Austin, Texas, and the heart of our conversation will be a book, UFOs and Government, a Historical Inquiry. Robert Powell was a project administrator, editor, and author of the book, together with 8 other colleagues. UFOs and Government is an exceptional and exciting book written by authors that were part of UFO History Group, and this fine work brings analytical complexity of the UFO phenomena from World War II up to the current days. The work of authors stands on the shoulder of facts, official documents, and sterling sources. The book is focused towards military and intelligence circles and describes in detail their long-term struggle on how to handle the unwanted problem of UFOs. In the description of this show, you will be able to find a link for my review of the book that I wrote in September 2012, and that same review was also published in MUFON UFO Journal in December 2012 issue. So, as you can see, I'm obviously a big fan of the book. I'm considering this book as the best UFO book ever written, obviously my personal opinion, more about it in the interview with Robert. And for this interview, Robert and I have also prepared 7 audio clips that will illustrate the atmosphere and the history of the UFO phenomena as we move through time with our subjects. One exclusive audio clip was provided by Robert from his deep archives. We will be able to hear statements from Jay Nugel, a Boeing engineer, about his insights into radar, UFO and aeronautical incidents back in 1952. And we will also cover Washington UFO Flap, Pentagon press conference, J. Allen Hynek's recollection of Robertson panel, news reports about Michigan UFO Flap from 1966, comments from then Congressman, later President Gerald Ford, and Congressman Edward J. Rausch about the phenomena and Michigan Flap, and direct comments from Edward Condon and Robert Lowe about the progress of Condon Committee at the time. The audio clips were also extracted from my archives and they were collected by one and only Wendy Connors in her remarkable work and audio albums called Faded Discs. As you maybe know, I'm currently maintaining the archives of Faded Discs on archive.org. And there, me and great researcher Isaac Coy initiated a project in November 2013 to offer this collection in public domain for all other interested researchers and parties. So I'm so happy that Robert is today with us. I'm following his work for years. I respect him tremendously. And in a few moments, Robert Powell and UFOs and Government, a historical inquiry, the book that was published in July 2012.
Something strange was in the skies over Texas in January. Expert analysis and maybe some answers ahead. And in Austin is Robert Powell. He also obtained radar data relating the Stevensville UFO sightings.
Hello everyone, and today we will have a guest from United States, a researcher that I respect so much. I'm following his work for years. And the heart of our interview today will be an exceptional book, UFOs and Government, a historical inquiry, exceptional work by 9 scholars and researchers, and the book that I proclaimed once as the best UFO book ever written. And I'll speak more about it during the interview. But before we delve into that, I would like for Robert to give us his overview of his career, how he started to delve with UFO issue in the first place, and then we'll move towards the book. So, Robert, the mic is yours.
All right. Well, hello, Juliana, and thank you very much for inviting me to your station. I first became interested in the UFO phenomenon when I was a teenager, when I read one of J. Allen Hynek's books. And of course, like most people, you have to go to college and get married and have a family, and there's not a lot of time for UFOs during that. So I went to college, obtained a degree in chemistry. I went to work in the semiconductor field, became an engineering manager. I was also the manager of a state-of-the-art chemistry laboratory, as well as an R&D facility for semiconductors. And I received 4 patents while I was there. And then I retired. I retired early, about 10 years ago. And once I retired, it was like time, okay, I can do what I want to do now. And one of the things I had always wanted to do was study the UFO phenomenon. So in 2006, I began to study the phenomenon. And that's kind of how I got started in UFOs.
Yeah, and I think your selection was absolutely great because Allen Hynek's book, who was a collaborator and consultant of the Air Force Project Blue Book, has great history inside of the research and many technical aspects, so I can definitely understand how you sort of connected your technical background with this fine work.
Yes, and it was a perfect fit for me because I always enjoy science. And so I took the approach to the topic, just like everything else I had in my career, in terms of looking at it as realistically and objectively as possible.
So at one point of your research endeavor, you came to an idea to create and produce very important book. Please explain to us how this process was moving for you.
The book actually started in early 2007. I had obtained the name of Mike Swords because someone had mentioned to me it would be great to have a good history of this phenomenon. And they had given me Mike's name, so I called Mike and talked to him about producing a book and having a number of collaborators. And of course, Mike was very hesitant. He said, well, it's very difficult in this field to get several people together and get them to do anything. And so I told Mike, well, that's kind of what I've done all my career as a manager in the semiconductor field. So I convinced him that I would make it happen. And so after talking to Mike, I got a hold of Jan Aldrich and Barry Greenwood, and a guy by the name of Richard Thiem and Steve Purcell, who were all American ufologists. And then I contacted, and this was all based on Mike's suggestion as to who we should contact, Bill Chalker for Australia, and Klaus Spahn for Sweden, and Vicente Juan Olmos for Spain. And I tried to get for France some of the French ufologists, but I did not have any luck. And so we weren't able to get one of the noted French ufologists for the book. And so that's how it began. And we had our first meeting in early 2007 in Dallas, Texas, and everyone flew down and we met each other. And that's where we first started actually brainstorming on what this book should be about.
Yeah, so the idea for the book UFOs and Government was born, and you collected all the collaborators, and it was a great selection. But I'm wondering. Well, definitely you mentioned Michael Swartz, and I know he's also reluctant to give interviews. I think I saw him only in a couple of documentaries. It was ABC documentary UFO Seeing is Believing, and I think I saw him in Canadian documentary UFO Secret History. And he has such a great approach, very serious, always has clear facts and so on. So that is a great heart of the team that you were able to collect. But I'm wondering, the whole idea, you had a support, I think, at the time from MUFON, right? It was sort of overlapping with MUFON as a group, or was it completely your sort of a private project and independent from MUFON?
Well, it was a little bit of a combination. James Carrion was the director of MUFON at the time, and I was the director of research. And so James suggested that I try to put together a team that would basically try to prove, based on history, that the UFO phenomenon was real. And so that's how it started. But actually, once I met Mike and the other guys, it kind of developed a life of its own. And so what it became was much more than anything we had originally intended.
Exactly. And I think the technical problems through the way were really staggering. And of course, it is a large volume book with so many pages, sources, and even photographs. And I do recall I heard you once in the interview when you said that only with this book you actually figured it out how the copyright law was so complicated and why many books don't feature photos anymore. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that editing aspect and compilation.
Exactly. It took us a total of 5 years to complete the book. And we already had the information. I mean, Mike Swords, Jan Aldrich, and Barry Greenwood were the three primary guys who had all of the information already. But for example, in what you brought up, copyright law, we have over 200 photos in the book. And so I handled most of the copyright issues and negotiated back and forth with Mike and Jan as to what photos we could and could not use. And I learned a lot about copyright law, and I could understand why very few books have photos in them anymore, because it's just a very slippery slope. So what we did, if we could not get an individual to release copyright on a photograph, then we used military photographs. And so the book has a large number of military photographs because those are all in the public domain, and so they're available for anyone's use. But to give your listeners an idea of how the book was written, Mike Swords predominantly wrote most of the chapters. So he would send me chapters. I would run them through the group, right? I would send copies of those chapters because Mike hand wrote all these chapters. So I would type them up, send them out to the rest of the group, get inputs, make changes, make sure everyone was okay with the changes. And then I would make editing and grammar changes into how we worded things. And then I would, place the photos. We basically did everything that a publisher normally does. So we set up the block for the photos and everything. As far as writing chapters, the only chapter that I contributed solely to was the French chapter. And I kind of enjoyed that because my mother's French and I speak a little French, not a lot. But that did help me in reading and going through the French documents because it's a lot easier to read a language than it is to speak a language.
Oh yeah, and that explains the gap when you said that you couldn't acquire any French researcher, and I was thinking, but I do recall there was a French chapter there, so that completely explains it. So that's great, and it really nicely filled the hole. That really represents very complicated project and so many aspects, compilation, selection, like you said. And when I was looking all these photos, and I was working for publishing companies in the past, and I do recall asking myself how this was done. It was really hard to understand, and you really nicely explained, and that I really think that's additional layer why this is such a unique and an exceptional book. Maybe we could now move to the content of the book itself, the history which it covers, and how are you starting with the book? What are the first timelines that you are covering?
Well, when we first began on the book, the first question that was asked among the entire group was, where do we begin? Because we could have begun hundreds or thousands of years ago, right, with some evidence of unknown phenomena that had been seen over the history of humanity. But what we decided as a group was that it made the most sense to begin in the modern era of ufology. In other words, when did this just take off? When was there a sudden surge in UFO reports that began and never really has ended since then? And that time period was World War II, with the commencement of what the American pilots called Foo Fighters. And so those first began in about 1944. And so that's where we decided to begin the book, is with the Foo Fighter.
Can you expand a little bit about this phenomena? I think, of course, it was happening during World War II, but I guess the key point was after the war when the crews and pilots figured it out from both of their sides that actually they were not dealing with enemy aircraft.
Right. At the end of World War II, which was 1945, right, the United States and the Soviet Union both had one major objective, and that was to get as many German scientists as they could. And the reason was the German scientists were the best in the world at that period of time. And they were the ones who invented jet aircraft. So we wanted to get that information. So there was a big rush between us and Russia to get those Germans. And so one of the things that happened was we took these Foo Fighter reports that American pilots had gotten, and we sent over an individual to go investigate in both Europe and the Pacific to try to find out, okay, what do the Germans and the Japanese know about the Foo Fighters? And of course, what he discovered when he went across was that they had the same thought we did. They thought it was some type of American new weapon or a communication device or something. And that's what we had thought. We thought perhaps this was some new Nazi or new Japanese device, because they were seen in both the Western and the Eastern fronts of the war. So that was kind of the beginning of the whole affair with unidentified flying objects. And from there, it went to the ghost rockets of 1947 and 46, which were rocket-type devices seen in Sweden and Norway. And to this day, we don't know for certain if those are truly part of the UFO phenomenon, or whether or not those were tests of B-1, B-2 rockets by the Soviets. You could make arguments in both directions. But that's kind of the first 2 to 3 years of the UFO phenomenon. And probably a lot of people in the government thought that that was all there was to it until 1947. And that's when the phenomenon really took off in the United States.
And I just wanted quickly to add that there is really great extensive chapter about ghost rockets in the book with pictures, facts, and I think Klaus Swan, right? He did really great job in that chapter. Yes. Klaus
wrote our chapter for ghost rockets, and he did an excellent job on that.
Okay, we now move to 1947. The stimuli that actually caused the reaction of the government's interest in the phenomena itself. But let's start with the initial case that sort of marked the modern era of the phenomena.
Well, the first case that really hit the modern era was the Kenneth Arnold case, which we just celebrated the 70th anniversary of that last month. July of 1947 was the Kenneth Arnold case. Now, there actually are cases in the United States prior to Kenneth Arnold, and we mentioned a few of those in the book, but the Kenneth Arnold case was the one that really brought it to the attention of the media. And, of course, most of your listeners may know that was a case of a civilian pilot who was flying near Mount Rainier when he sees 5 to 7 objects in formation. And he actually describes the objects as moving through the air almost as the way a saucer skips across the water should you throw it. But the media mistook exactly what he said, and of course, then was born the term the flying saucer because of a saucer skipping across the water. But they interpreted that to, be the shape of the saucer, which that was the shape of a lot of objects that had been seen.
Sure. As we sort of mentioned, that was, of course, not the singular only case, but we had, after that, multiple cases, aeronautical incidents, that led to government investigation, and also famous Nathan Twining memo that we have thanks to Freedom of Information. There is a key line in that document, so maybe you can introduce it to our listeners, the meaning of that memo.
Yeah, the key to the memo is the listener needs to understand, of course, Nathan Twining was a general in the United States Air Force. He was at a high position, and he came out with a statement that these objects are real, they are not fictitious, and he described them as roughly the size of a jet, and he said they indicate there's indication that they're intelligently controlled because they avoid our aircraft when our aircraft go up to meet them. And so that within itself really tells you that the U.S. government at that point in time considered the UFO phenomenon as a real concern for the nation as a whole.
Exactly, which will be a direct paradox later with Condon Committee that we will say. But yeah, that's really interesting. In that first initial stimuli, they had clear and cut situation with what they are dealing with.
Right. And there was no doubt in their mind that they weren't dealing with people seeing, high altitude balloons or unknowns and misinterpretations. I mean, clearly there are always a large number of misinterpretations, but the Air Force felt that there was reality to this phenomenon.
Exactly. Of course, we have rich history of UFO phenomenon in United States, which led to investigations and three bodies like Sign, Grudge, and Blue Book. But we can maybe now talk a little bit about Sign, the first investigation committee, which also produced a document that unfortunately we don't have today. Estimate of the situation, but we have historical references to it. Maybe you can explain that really interesting part a little bit more.
Right. The what you referred to, the estimate of the situation, is probably the document that UFO historians would like to get their hands on if they could. So, but all we do have is, like you mentioned, is we have references to the estimate of the situation in other documents, and we have individuals who have told us the estimate of the situation existed. Now, what that means when we say estimate of the situation, the organization called SIGN, which was made up of military officers, had reviewed all the data in the United States up through that period of time, which was late 1948. So they had about a little bit more than a year worth of information. And most of these are military cases, very few civilian cases, mostly military. And so they evaluated it. And in the military, when they do an evaluation, they call that an estimate of the situation. In this particular case, the situation was the UFO phenomenon, which they called flying saucers back then. In the estimate of the situation, what they were looking for, because there was a big concern. Remember how I said that we were wanting German scientists, and so was the Soviet Union. Well, one of the big concerns were these UFOs a new type of aircraft developed for the Soviets by the German scientists that they had obtained? So that was still a concern. So in the estimate of the situation, they evaluated that, right? But they also evaluated the possibility that it was not a Soviet weapon or a Soviet aircraft. And so one possibility they brought up was, well, it could be possible that these craft are made by a civilization that are not of this world. So that was put into the report. They didn't, from what we can tell, they didn't say that's definitely what it was. They were saying this is one of the possibilities. Well, it went up the chain of command, and General Cabell, who was the chief of intelligence of the Air Force, he sent it up to his superior. He did not say, no, we're not going to do that. He sent it to his superior. His superior was General Vandenberg. When General Vandenberg saw that, though, he batted it back down. And he said, there is no way we're going to even talk about that as a possibility. And shortly thereafter, SIGN was disbanded. The officers that were part of SIGN were sent to other locations, and they created a new organization. And it's kind of odd, the name, called Project Grudge.
Yeah.
So you almost wonder if that was the Vandenberg's grudge against those guys. And so that's kind of the story of the beginning of the UFO investigation by the U.S. Government. But one thing that tells you is they didn't want those guys around anymore because they didn't want that theory thrown about. But at the same time, they still thought that UFOs had to continue to be investigated, which is why they created Project Grudge.
And sometimes it is known as the middle age of the investigation, or the era when they start to downplay the incidents. And I think Edward Ruppel's book also covers this area nicely. But still, which is also explained greatly in the book, there were objections about this attitude and the new policy, and General Cabell was not happy with the answers that he was getting, right?
That's correct. Actually, General Cabell, what he did is very similar to what you see done in the military and in the government today on any topic, not necessarily UFOs, right? What Cabell said, because he had this problem. So he told his officers, and he basically gave them what we call a canned response to the media. In other words, if you're asked about a UFO investigation, you will say the following. And we've got this actually from Freedom of Information requests, that what he had was a statement that said, "We have investigated and evaluated blank incident, and we have found nothing." So on the one hand, Cabell's telling his guys, tell the public everything's fine, we haven't found anything of interest. But on the other hand, he was telling his soldiers, his officers, I want a solution to the UFO phenomenon. And some of his guys weren't taking it seriously, and that's actually brought out by Ruppelt, who was the first head of Project Blue Book. And he points out that Cabell got very upset with his officers because some of them were not taking seriously the investigation of the UFOs. As he stated, he said, I want an answer to the flying saucer problem, and I want the answer now. Meanwhile, of course, what he tells the public is totally different.
Exactly. And I will just add that there is really nice part in the book where we have sort of a description of the meeting with Cabell when he's saying how he's objecting current policy. And this is also one of my favorite parts of the book. And I do recall Billy Cooks from Herald Tribune wrote a couple of articles at the time, and I do recall one article was just about that meeting, and so we all sort of recognize how this was really greatly explained in details what Cabell was saying at the meeting, how he was objecting. That was really exciting part, I must say. So I really appreciate that that this part was in the book. It was referenced in the Edward Ruppel's book about Project Blue Book and UFOs, but that was the first time when I saw that with so many details in UFOs and Government book.
Yeah, yes, that came out of actually Ruppelt's personal notes, which Mike Swords had a copy of. So that's where we obtained that. And you know what I like? Doesn't it remind you exactly of how our government works today on almost any topic?
Only behind the closed doors you will actually see the problem and how it is sort of the layers of it. But of course, on the public relations, everything is fine, good, under control, and this situation sort of explains it. Anyway, that is what I so appreciate that is in the book. Some part of this history listeners will probably know, but I think it's always good to go to the basic, to the sources, especially today with so many noises in the field, so many speculations. I think it's really good to have here the clear ground, and that's why I think this book is so important. And not only that, Robert was so kind that he sent me also one exclusive audio clip from Boeing engineer. We are now moving slowly now towards 50s and the Washington Flap. And it will be great, Robert, if you can set up the stage and explain what is the meaning of this audio clip that we will soon hear.
Okay, so let me tell your audience a little bit about how we got and obtained this audio clip. We knew that Roy Craig, or actually it's Dr. Roy Craig, he had a PhD in chemistry. He was part of the Condon Committee, which back in 67 and 68 investigated UFOs for the Air Force. So all his papers were left at the archival library at Texas A&M. It's called the Cushing Archival Library. So Mike Swords flew down from Kalamazoo to Austin, Texas, where I live. And so he and I then drove to College Station, which is the location of Texas A&M. It's about a 2-hour drive. And we went through the Roy Craig files. And not only did we get all the notes and just lots of good information, we also got some audio tapes. And before you play the audio tapes, let me let your audience know something about Roy Craig, something we did not actually mention in the book. In the semiconductor field where I worked, a lot of the guys who worked for me were PhDs, and because it was a research lab. And when I looked at Roy Craig's notes and the way he operated, it's just like the PhDs that worked for me at Advanced Micro Devices. They're very sharp, but when they hit a brick wall, especially if it's a political brick wall, not a scientific brick wall, but a political human-induced brick wall, often they just stop and they don't try to break through it. And that's the same thing I saw with Roy Craig, because in this audio tape that you're going to give to your audience momentarily, the Boeing engineer, Jay, and I don't recall Jay's last name at the moment, but he actually told Roy Craig the name of his officer so Roy Craig could go verify this and get more information. And yet you could see in his notes where it was going to be very difficult to do that. And so he just did not pursue it further. So having said that, I think listening to this tape really gives the audience a feel for what the U.S. government at this time, 1952, how they were viewing the UFO phenomenon.
Yeah, the last name I think is Noggle, right? Or Noggle? I'm not
Yes,
sure.
that's correct. It's Jay Noggle.
Oh, yeah, great. Okay, I trimmed it down to about 2-3 minutes. It was a little bit of poor quality, but I tried to enhance it as much as possible. So we will now listen, and then we will also shortly comment it after it is done. So here it goes.
The following information is presented by Mr. J. Noggle, an engineer employed by the Boeing Company at Malmstrom Air Base.
So in 1952, the radar commander, the battery commander, noted on our acquisition radar a blip that appeared about the size of a fighter aircraft. And this type of radar has a plotting board that shows both azimuth, range, and elevation plots. Objects we picked up showed itself to be hovering at stationary at 18,000 feet. And then 2 or 3 other radars in the area, other batteries spread out across that New Jersey sector there, also picked up the same object reported in. But it didn't do anything for about a half hour, and then it started to move. By the time it reached the edge of the scope, the thing was moving too fast for us to track. And I believe the radars at that time could track at least 1,000 miles per hour. And we didn't have any aircraft at that time that would go that fast. So we didn't think too much of ourselves that night. But then the next morning, the battalion commander, who was a light colonel, came into our radar and wanted to know what happened and all the background. And apparently this report went all the way to the Pentagon that night, and the orders came back that if another one came in like this, to fire on. Also, of course, after that first night, we not only had orders to fire on, and we didn't load our guns, which is an unusual thing to do over an area that has population below us. But we'd also scrambled and fired off McGuire Air Force Base. And about the time we scrambled, these were F-94s at that time, about the time the fighters would take off, these objects would leave. They take off and leave our radar scope, so that it seemed to us, at least, or myself, that these objects seemed to know when the fighters were taking off and then would leave the area.
So that was the clip. To set the stage, it was June 1952, so 1 month before the Washington Flap, right? And we already have culmination of the problem, right? So he was speaking about the radar detections, and then the order came what to do about it. So you can maybe expand further.
Right. So here's what, many people say, that was a radar error caused by an inversion in the atmosphere, right? But in this case, for someone who really understands that, that's clearly not what the case is, because you have a situation where an object is on the radar, and it's on multiple radar sites. It's not just on Jay Nogle's radar station, right? The other operators on other radar sites at other locations are also seeing it. And then he sees it stationary. And then to go from stationary to a movement of 1,000 miles an hour is something that is very difficult to explain with an inversion. But what tells you even more is that the military, they certainly didn't believe this was an inversion, because they gave the orders for these guys to be ready to fire with 90 millimeter artillery, which is tied to the radar stations, over highly populated civilian areas. Well, I mean, you're risking civilian lives, because when those shells don't hit anything, they come back down to the ground, and you have a highly populated area. So this, to me, really tells you that the military truly felt that they had objects in the air which were real and not just atmospheric inversions.
And also this order to fire and shoot them down, and especially the last part when he said he was having feelings, then objects or phenomena or whatever, it was sort of new, and whenever the airplanes would came sort of into a range, the objects would quickly and rapidly move out of the range, which is sort of a pattern that we will start to notice more and more with other cases too, right?
Correct. Yes, that's a common feature that's in a lot of UFO cases.
And we are now in July 1952, and of course we have one of the most famous flaps above Washington. So this caused quite a bit of stir and caused even political problems from the sense of the UFO research, defined the policy that maybe we are still feeling through this day. So can you set the stage about the Washington flap and all the complications and implications that led to?
Sure. So bear in mind, like you just mentioned, only 1 month earlier was the case with Jay Nogle, right? And that was just north of Washington, D.C., by about 70 to 100 miles in the New Jersey area. And the Nogle incident was not a single incident on one day. It was going on for a period of 30 days. So there's really a historical perspective to this right before what happens in Washington, D.C. So then a month goes by, a month later, and then Reagan National Airport picks up unknowns on their radar system. And this was serious enough problem, they scrambled jets to try to identify and intercept the unknowns. This became such an incident, and this is probably hard, especially for your younger audience, to realize. This was a headline in the Washington Post. Can you imagine today a headline in the Washington Post of UFOs over the nation's capital? Well, that's exactly what happened in July of 1952. Well, needless to say, that incident went all the way up to Harry Truman, who was president at the time. And he basically told Sanford, who was his general of the Air Force over the entire Air Force, to hold a press conference, and that, answers needed to be given. And our favorite quote that Sanford said, because he did not want to say, right, he's the Air Force, he's responsible for the skies over the United States. So there's no way he would want to say, we don't know what it is. So basically, he kind of skirted the issue, but not wanting to insult the public who had seen these objects, he said, credible people have seen incredible things. So he gave a certain amount of reality to the incident.
Which is also the quote on the back cover of your book, in bold.
Right.
Yeah.
That's one of our favorites.
Yeah, it is. That's a really great case. And now to sort of give better illustration to audience, the feelings of the time and what was happening, I have two audio clips. One is from Albert Chop, which was Pentagon's public information officer, who also gave statements at the time. And then we will also hear very short extract from the famous July 29, 1952 press conference of Major General Sanford, where he gave this quote that Robert has just mentioned. So let's hear those two clips that will illustrate the Washington Flap in 1952.
The ground radar at Washington International was picking up UFO returns. People were reporting eyewitness sightings of strange lights in the sky. And when I got down there, Life magazine was there and a few other publications, some of the local newspapers. And we did ask the Air Defense Command to send up a flight of interceptors. They did send up a flight. The flight failed to see anything, although we were getting the target returns on the ground and trying to direct them to the targets. They failed to report that they saw anything, and subsequently they went back to Newcastle, Delaware, where they were based. And along about 2 or 3 in the morning, we asked for another flight because we were still getting these returns. And they sent up another flight, and this time one of the pilots reported that he did see a group of lights that we were trying to direct him to, or a group of targets. And he flew towards them, and obviously from his report, then they appeared to be all around him, which he reported to us, and then they moved off according to the ground radar, and according to his report. He said they're going away, and he then returned to the base, and that's about the gist of what happened in Washington, I think.
I am here to discuss the so-called flying saucers. The Air Force interest in this problem has been due to our feeling of an obligation to identify and analyze to the best of our ability anything in the air that may have the possibility of threat or menace to the United States. In pursuit of this obligation, since 1947, we have received and analyzed between 1,000 and 2,000 reports that have come to us from all kinds of sources. Of this great mass of reports, we have been able adequately to explain the great bulk of them, explain them to our own satisfaction. We've been able to explain them as hoaxes, as erroneously identified friendly aircraft, as meteorological or electronic phenomena, or as light aberrations. However, there have been a certain percentage of this volume of reports that have been made by credible observers of relatively incredible things. It is this group of observations that we now are attempting to resolve. Our basic difficulty in dealing with these is that there is no measurement of them that makes it possible for us to put them in any pattern that would be profitable for a deliberate, custom sort of analysis to take the next step. We have, as of date, come to only one firm conclusion with respect to this remaining percentage, and that is that it does not contain any pattern of purpose or of consistency that we can relate to any conceivable threat to the United States. We can say that the recent sightings are in no way connected with any secret development by any agency of the United States.
Okay, so we just covered Washington Flap, and then, like we shortly mentioned, caused a really big problem for the Air Force, which led in the end to Robertson panel that has its story on its own, right? And that was a really huge deal for the future of the field itself. So can you explain to our audience what the Robertson panel was and what was the outcome of this event?
Well, the Robertson panel was basically a group of scientists that had been commissioned by the Air Force and the CIA to investigate the UFO phenomenon. Now, to put it in perspective, realize that this is early 1953, in January, as a matter of fact, and it was only 6 months ago that this flap occurred over Washington, D.C. So one of the key things that the Air Force wants is they do not want another public relations disaster like happened after the UFO over the Capitol incident. So they and the CIA, and it was really the CIA who took the lead, decided to create the Robertson panel a group of scientists that would go out and investigate. Well, it really was not a true non-biased investigation. These guys met for 10 days, some of the participants not even for 10 days. And the interesting thing is that 4 months before the Robertson panel ever convened, the CIA met with Robertson. And Chadwell, the assistant director of scientific intelligence for the CIA, actually discussed in documents that we have FOIAs of the same points that became the final conclusions of the Robertson panel. And those points were, one, that we need rapid identification of UFOs so we don't confuse them with Soviet aircraft. Two, that there's a big psychological warfare component in this. In other words, if you recall back in those days, if you had a large number of people who became concerned and were making phone calls, you would swamp your communication system, because back then phone systems couldn't handle large numbers of people calling in. And then third, really interesting, was the CIA wanted a policy of basically debunking UFOs to the public. And their argument was, well, this could cause panic, the whole concept of UFOs, so we need to debunk them so that the public will not panic. Well, in January of 1953, the Robertson panel, which only met for a few days, basically came out with the exact conclusions the CIA had had 4 months earlier.
And we are sort of feeling this outcome to this day, unfortunately. And again, to illustrate the situation, I have really great audio clip from the deep archives. It will be J. Allen Hynek, the consultant of the Air Force, who was also present at the Robertson panel meetings. This audio recording is from 1974, and 21 years after the panel, Hynek will recall the atmosphere in the room and what was happening. So this is the clip.
Questions of the Robertson panel meeting, and the whole proceedings were rather formal and rather brusque, I thought. There did not seem to be the weigh and consider attitude that one has been taught to expect of scientists, but rather an offhand dismissal of the cases presented. And as far as the cases presented, they were hardly representative of the many I had read. I could have picked many others that I feel they should have looked at. The order of the day was UFOs are natural things, people are silly and deluded, and the data presented that a physicist wants, they gave the impression to me that they wanted impeccable photographs, charts, graphs, names and addresses of the UFOnauts, equations, and the proverbial landing on the White House lawn. Even though I was considered a debunker myself, I felt that the court was not a scientific court. They were jumping to conclusions at a very, very great rate. In short, I wanted the subject to have a fair hearing, and I certainly didn't feel, in fact, there was just no question, that at least during the time I was in their presence, the subject did not have a fair hearing. During the meetings, the military implications of the flap of 1952, the crowding of the military wires, and so that if some enemy, for instance, had wanted to perpetrate a Pearl Harbor, let's say, all they would have needed to do was to get their agents to spawn a whole bunch of UFO reports at the right time, and it's quite true that the military wires would have been clogged, and one wouldn't have been able to tell a UFO from a missile from a hole in the ground. So I recognized the danger that UFO reports at critical times could, the danger that they could be at critical times. Another way to describe their basic attitude that got under my skin was very clearly an attitude of daddy knows best. Don't come to me with these silly stories. I know what's good for you, and don't argue. While I was not impressed with their results or in their manner of going about it, in fact, I was rather disappointed and almost disgusted. My experience with the Robertson panel stayed with me, and years later, when I wrote a strong recommendation to the Air Force that a scientific panel should be set up to study the whole situation, and I specifically said that scientists, although good scientists should be chosen, they should be those who had sufficient time to do their homework.
So that was Robertson panel, and now we can say sort of an era from 1953 to, let's say, to another escalation, 1966, which is Michigan UFO Flap. But a lot of things happened in this era. So we can try to shortly break down the best highlights, what was happening in these years for the field of research itself, and also from the perspective of the UFO investigation, which is now led by the Project Blue Book.
Yes, in the mid-1950s, a gentleman by the name of Donald Kehoe, who was a former major, became a real sore in the side of the Air Force. In the beginning, he was just a single individual, and so he did not cause the Air Force too much problem. However, there was an organization that got created, and Donald Kehoe became a major part of it. And that organization was the first large UFO organization, and it was called NICAP. What really gave NICAP extra strength was not only was one of its members Admiral Farner, who was of the Navy, but Admiral Hellencoder, who was also a Navy admiral. But more importantly, Admiral Hellencoder was the first head of the CIA. So to have a civilian organization that has two admirals, one of them the original head of the CIA, and Donald Kehoe being the guy who's causing the Air Force all these headaches, in the mid-50s, this became a big concern for the Air Force because they were wanting congressional investigations. And the last thing the Air Force wants is a congressional investigation of anything, because all they want Congress to do is give them their money and pass their budget. They certainly don't want investigations.
And there was lots of these efforts, and they went up and down. He always was pushing for it, but I guess the biggest catalyst of this happened in 1966 with the Michigan UFO Flap and infamous swamp gas explanation. So can you explain those events and how this was developing in 1966?
Sure. And swamp gas has become a statement of lore in our society now, right? You say something was swamp gas, then you know you're saying it's something that's not real. Well, in Michigan, there had been reports at two different locations by police as well as citizenry of an object that was rising up from the ground, going up in the sky, coming back down and landing. And this caused a big public relations headache for the Air Force. So what does the Air Force do? They send in Alan Hynek. And because he was the main scientist on the Air Force payroll whose job was to debunk UFOs. So he goes and he investigates it. He's not sure exactly what this is, right? But he gets a call on the phone from someone in Washington. And they say, well, why don't you say it could be swamp gas, right? I mean, and swamp gas would be methane gas that is rising from the ground and suddenly it ignites, so you get this ball of fire, right? Yeah. So Hynek goes on and claims it's swamp gas. Well, this explanation was so weak that all it did was upset all of the citizenry of Michigan. Well, the problem is it so happens that Michigan's congressman was a guy by the name of Gerald Ford, who would someday become president, of course. And being a good politician, like all politicians, he wanted to make sure his constituency was happy in Michigan. And if the Air Force was upsetting his constituency, he was going to do something about it. So he proceeded to haul the Air Force before Congress to determine why aren't they giving us the truth on UFOs. And in this incident, the Air Force did everything they could to stop that investigation. Harold Brown, the head of the Air Force, became involved in it, and they basically had to call in all of their favors, and they got the congressional investigation stopped. But needless to say, this is what I thought was the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. The Air Force had had enough of the UFO phenomenon at this point in time. So their objective, I think, once this happened, was to get, as we say, the monkey off their back, because UFOs had become nothing more than a huge headache for the Air Force.
And again, to illustrate these events, I have two audio clips. Like Robert nicely explained, the swamp gas actually caused this factory of the public at the time. This theory looked so forced, and there was many objections, and there were even news reports against Hynek's proposed explanations, which we'll now hear from one of the news reports from 1966, and after that statements from Congressman Gerald Ford, later president, and Congressman Edward J. Roush, which will really illustrate perfectly the whole situation that was happening at the time in Michigan.
Just 4 weeks ago, the Midwest came alive with reports of unidentified flying objects. Scores of persons told of UFOs in an area of about 900 square miles in 4 states. The Air Force sent its chief investigator on UFOs, Dr. J. Allen Hynek, to find an answer. His answer came less than 2 days later.
They told me that it is characteristic of swamps to develop quite a bit of marsh gas. I can't prove that this is the case, but it seems to me a very likely explanation.
Rarely has an explanation been greeted with such hostility. Ann Arbor Sheriff Douglas Harvey said of Dr. Hynek,
"He's all wet. Last night he was in my office. He told me he had no idea what it was, but he said the Pentagon said that he had to make a statement tomorrow."
I'm Jim Nettleton, and this is WDRC's Hot Seat. Tonight and next week, UFOs, the mystery and the challenge.
A prominent congressman from Michigan thinks there should be a further investigation of the strange UFO reports. House Minority Leader Gerald Ford said this today.
The Congress should investigate the rash of reported sightings of unidentified flying objects in southern Michigan and other parts of the country. A congressional inquiry would be most worthwhile because the American people are becoming most interested and, in many instances, very alarmed by the UFO stories. I firmly believe the American people would feel much better if there was a full-blown investigation of these alleged incidents.
Congressman Gerald Ford.
And now let's also hear statements from Congressman Edward J. Roush, where he also comments the Michigan UFO Flap and all the stir that was happening around it. In March 1966,
people want to know what a UFO is, and therefore any chance that we have to learn, we should take advantage of it. When you tell an American, I can't explain it, he wants to know, why can't you explain it? Why doesn't someone explain it? I want someone to explain it. And I think that kind of pressure is going to change the view of many government officials and members of Congress in the future. I think the people should be told. I think there's nothing which is more frightening than to be confronted with something that is new, and particularly in this area. And through knowledge, we can perhaps relieve the fears of a lot of people. I want to know. I should know. I deserve to know. And this curiosity which I have and which is whetted by the various sightings is such that I want to pursue it. Just as I think the great majority of the American people would like to pursue the question in order to come to the place where they have an answer.
After that, of course, like you explained, and we are now leading towards Project Colorado and Condon report, which is sort of the final solution of the UFO question after 21 years of Air Force research. So how this situation ended?
The Air Force felt that UFOs were not a threat to national security. There was no indication that they were a threat. However, they were a thorn in the side of the Air Force because of the constant publicity and issues with Congress. So the U.S. Air Force proceeded to look for a university that basically would reach those conclusions for them. So they reached out to a lot of different universities, and surprise, but none of those colleges and universities wanted to have anything to do with the UFO topic. So finally, the Air Force called on Condon, who was at the University of Colorado, and Edward Condon had Air Force contracts in the past. So the Air Force was kind of calling in their favors. And so thus they developed what was later called the Condon Committee or the Colorado Project, where they went and investigated UFOs. And to me, the most amazing part of that is if you actually go in and read the 1,000-page document that they produced, all the different scientists that were involved in it, there were cases they could not explain, and some of those scientists actually said, we need to do further investigation of this phenomenon. But the executive summary, which was written by Condon and is all that most people ever read, those first pages basically is Condon supporting the Air Force contention, which of course, the first contention being there's no threat to national security, which to this day, as far as we know, there's not. And then the second point being that the Air Force should not have to spend their time looking at this phenomenon. And so that was the final conclusion. And then it was only, about 1 year later that the Air Force made their final statement that no longer would they investigate UFOs.
Before we move deeper into that and make more comments about Condon Committee, here is another audio clip that would illustrate the atmosphere at the time. This interview was done with Dr. Edward Condon, the head of the committee, and Dr. Robert Lowe, the administrator. They were interviewed in 1967. They were starting to analyze the UFO phenomenon. And you can clearly hear in this clip how their first impressions about the subject that could be quickly and easily resolved, they were starting to notice complex layers about it.
Spending the most time on the study is Bob Lowe, Assistant Dean of the Graduate School and UFO Project Coordinator. His office is the center of project activities. Lowe has 2 secretaries. He also has a small library on UFOs, a modest selection of pictures, and a mounting pile of correspondence. I asked if any large problems have come up in the project.
Well, the whole problem is a big puzzle, and I don't think one can say that big problems come up, but we certainly have a difficult problem to pursue. It's hard to know how to go about studying this thing. How would you do it if somebody suddenly handed you the job? You investigate unidentified flying objects. How do you go about doing that? That's the problem that we've had, and we've been wrestling with it. It's a tough one, but I think we're making some headway.
The overall director of the project is Dr. Edward Condon, one of the most experienced and distinguished scientists in the United States or anywhere else. He's a physicist and a former director of the National Bureau of Standards in Washington, D.C. Condon is one of the main reasons the Air Force chose the University of Colorado for the UFO project. At the top of impressive Gila Tower on the CU campus, I talked with Dr. Condon and asked if he knows how the UFO study will now proceed.
Well, we're just getting started. I must say that the last 2.5 months or so that we've been looking into this indicate that the total situation is much more complicated than we appreciated at first, so that while we have some notions of what we're going to do, I don't have any feeling at all of a very orderly or well-organized thing at this stage. One of the most difficult things is that all of the phenomena are of such short duration, and the reports have a way of coming in after the thing is all over, so that it looks almost hopeless to plan on getting much in the way of being able to, hop in a car and dash out, or hop in a jet plane and dash out and get there yourself and see it before it's all over, because most people that see things only report after they've seen it and it's gone away, and then they come in and use the telephone, so it's too late. So that's a great difficulty. I don't mean to give up on that. The important thing would be to try to do that and get some pictures, better pictures, and pictures of which we were sure of the reliability simply because our own people had taken them. We would like to get some spectroscopic observations, but that too is difficult. One of the things that's common to many of the reports, I don't mean statistically, but a common category is people complain about ignition failures on their cars, and we're negotiating with some of the principal ignition engineers in Detroit to make a special study just on that phase of it. That I don't like to be more specific than that because it hasn't been fully set up yet, but we've had indications that we can get a group together that will look into that for us. Another characteristic is a good many people have reported, I'm not a medical man, so I don't quite know what the proper term is, but people report that feelings of heat, or as if they're like diathermy, heat treatment, being very, very much overcome with a feverish feeling when something like an UFO was around, when they were meaning by that they saw something. At the same time, feelings that would go away. So we're going to try to get some medical people to give a special attention to those reports. Of course, we'll look into all of the other things that have been suggested, like the ball lightning possibility and various other things. A great many of the things that have been suggested, it must be must be realized, are things that might be explanations of some of the reports. But I'm convinced there will be no one single thing that accounts for all of the reports, simply because they themselves are so different in character.
As the UFOs have attracted public attention nationally, so have they drawn reaction to the University of Colorado. I asked Dr. Condon about public reaction.
Oh, it's been very good. We've had a very large amount of mail. By that, I would guess between 700 or 800 to 1,000 letters along in there. A great many of them are from people that would like to have jobs, and I suppose I ought to say that there's not nearly as many jobs on this as people seem to think. Secondly, a lot of people have written in to tell us about experiences they've had. A good many university people who in other universities across the country have written in to volunteer their help, and I don't mean as job seekers in the sense of wanting to be on the payroll, but wanting to know what they can do cooperatively at their places. So the acceptance that way is extremely good at this time. Now, our problem is just to try to make some rational sense out of this very complicated picture.
And a complicated picture it is, not only for the University of Colorado, but for the Air Force, for private UFO organizations, and for plain Mr. Citizen who just wants some answers.
So after the conclusion of Condon Committee back in 1969, the Air Force used that argument to leave the business of UFOs. This is the crucial part also for me. I think this is absolutely fascinating part of the history and mostly overlooked, like to nicely explained with the content of the report itself, but also now gives an Air Force a nice shield. For example, whenever you send some sort of a request, they will send this copy-pasted reply. They will say, yeah, we researched it in 1969. We concluded there is no effect to national security. I do recall when Billy Cooks, in one of his articles for Herald Tribune, was interviewing Stephen J. Dick, the astronomer and archivist and historian of science. For example, he started the subject of UFOs, and then Stephen replied to Billy, yeah, but that was already researched and concluded, so that's the end of it. But actually it was not without controversy, and people maybe today it's harder for them to dig, but I can definitely recommend David Saunders' book titled UFOs, Yes, where the Condon Committee went wrong. And inside they can see that there was not sort of everything so perfectly nice. We have this trick memo, and actually David Saunders and other colleagues wanted to prepare counter-report. But of course later they were fired by Condon, so it's a whole controversy. The secretary was also, she resigned, I do recall that. That was in J. Allen Hynek's books, A Scientific Inquiry, and there is actually her letter because why she was resigning because of all this controversy. But unfortunately, nobody recalls that now. Everybody, like you said, recalls this summary, and if you ever ask somebody about UFOs, they will say, yeah, it's already done, we have Condon report, and it's concluded. And that's so unfortunate, right?
Right. And if you actually think logically about it, it really makes no sense, because the Air Force's job is defense of the nation, right? And so they have to look at everything. For example, let's say an ICBM is launched at the United States.
Yeah.
For the first few seconds, it's an unidentified flying object until it's identified.
Exactly.
So what they're saying is, if we can't identify it, then we're not going to worry about it. I mean, what kind of sense does that make? So where's that magic time? If an ICBM's launched, if you can't identify it after 2 minutes, we don't deal with UFOs. I mean, it makes no sense.
Yeah, that time window is ignored. So
yeah.
Oh my God, yeah, exactly. Well, anyway, the UFOs are still present. Condon report sort of was not able to kill the phenomenon, and of course today, like we said in the beginning, we shortly referred to the French chapter, and there is a still active research project that is researching UAPs or UFOs. We have CEFA in Chile, and there are a couple of them in other South American countries too today. Like in Uruguay, I think it's Cridovni, yeah. So the phenomena is still present. Other military bodies are still researching it. So Condon was not a too strong authority, it seems, for them. But we can speak a little bit now about this aftermath after the Condon. So we also had great progress during the era of Jimmy Carter's presidency, where we had sort of great amount of Freedom of Information Act documents that showed us that UFOs were still a problem from the military perspective.
Right. And, Loring Air Force Base, which was 1975, is a very good example to demonstrate that in reality, the Air Force still does investigate UFOs because the phenomenon hasn't gone away. It's still there, and they can't really ignore it despite what they may tell the public. So you have to put yourself in the history of 1975. Remember, Nixon had just resigned in 1972. Not long after that, the Freedom of Information Act was created. And it was created partly for that reason, because to prevent the government from hiding documents. Well, so when requests were made to the Air Force regarding an event that happened in 1975 at Loring Air Force Base, you actually have a situation where today you would never get those documents. But in 1975, because of what had just happened in the Freedom of Information Act just having been passed, the Air Force actually turned over 27 some odd documents on an event where an object actually penetrated the airspace of a ICBM Air Force base that's got B-52 bombers and stores nuclear weapons there. And this object was picked up on radar. It came onto the base. It was seen by two Air Force enlisted men on the base. They described it as a football-shaped object that was spinning and somewhere around 15 feet across and just hovering right above the ground. And amazingly, we've got all those documents. The same thing in 1976, Tehran, Iran, where F-4 Phantom jets, because Iran used to be our buddy, unlike today, and of course they flew American jets. They had two jets that went up to intercept a UFO that they had detected. When the lead jet locked on with his weapons, he lost all control of his weaponry system. Now, amazingly, and he lost communications, but he did not lose control of how to fly the aircraft, but he lost all his other controls. And this demonstrates a technology that even to this day we cannot imitate. I mean, we can, with the E-impulse, right, you can lose all control of your jet.
Sure.
But you can't just lose certain pieces of control. So, we had that event in 1976. I won't go into detail on all of this because I know you're limited on time, but the Japanese airliner of 1986 over Alaska, which was picked up not only by FAA radar, it was picked up by NORAD radar. And to this day, we've never received the NORAD radar. We only have the FAA radar data. And of course, the Phoenix Lights. And then Stephenville in 2008, which I was involved in personally and talked to all of the particular witnesses involved. And there's kind of a funny story on that. I don't know if we have time. I could give that to you.
No worries. You can go into it. No worries, Robert.
Okay. So remember how the Air Force is not supposed to talk about UFOs, right?
Yeah.
So what's supposed to happen is if you call a public relations officer at an Air Force base and say you had a UFO, he's supposed to say, just like what you had mentioned earlier, we do not investigate UFOs. Call MUFON or NICAP or CUFOS, one of these UFO organizations, and they'll investigate it for you. Well, Angela Joyner, the newspaper reporter who I know well, she called the public relations officer, who was a major at Carswell Air Force Base. And she said he was a very gregarious gentleman, and he told her, that could have been a plane that light was reflecting off. It could have been this. It could have been that. And he went on and discussed with her the possibilities of what these UFOs might have been. Well, about 2 weeks later, and one thing that public relations officer did say, he said, we did not have any F-16s in the air. Well, it so happens they did. And so 2 weeks later, he admits that. And so she's trying to call him and find out, well, why didn't you tell me about this? What's going on? Blah, 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 blah. He won't return her calls. Finally, after almost a week, she finally reaches him. And she says, this gregarious officer who was so bubbly and talkative, all he would say was, Miss Joyner, all I can say is, and then he would read this canned statement that the Air Force does not investigate UFOs, and that's no longer our charter. And she said, oh, come on, you talked to me before, talk to me. And he just repeats again, Mrs. Joyner, all I can say is, and then he reads his statement off. So this was a very good case of what happens to an Air Force officer if he does anything more than just say the Air Force does not investigate UFOs.
Exactly, he goes beyond the policy. I do recall these events still clearly, yeah. And I think that was the first time when I actually saw you when you were a guest on Larry King's show with your colleague at the time. And when you did the analysis of the radar data that showed there was unknown target at the area, right?
Oh, yeah, that was the best radar data I've ever personally had, because what had happened was the one of the witnesses, specifically the sheriff, or what we call the constable, he described to me, because I interviewed him personally. He said, here's the direction from my home where I saw them. Here's what they did. They moved to the northeast in extreme speed. Well, so I get the radar data, and I look at the location of his home on the radar. I look where he first sees the object, and there it is on radar. There's an object roughly 2 miles south of his home. And then when he says this object that's stationary suddenly moves to the northeast at an extreme speed, that's exactly what I saw on radar. So it was the most perfect case, because you had witness testimony, and then you had radar data that supported what the witness said he saw.
Yes, I also recall Billy Cooks wrote a couple of articles about it, contacted the Air Force. He was trying to present your report, and he was not getting anywhere. Yeah, there was very interesting times. I actually created a DVD with almost all media coverage for Angelia Joyner at the time. She was active with researchers, although I don't see her recently. I do see some posts from time on time on Facebook, but I think she's not active in the sort of a field anymore, right? Or she's behind the scenes maybe, or do maybe know more?
Yeah, Angela's no longer active in the investigation of UFOs anymore. She was very active during the Stephenville event and remained interested in the phenomenon for several years afterwards. But since then, she kind of monitors what goes on, but she's not active like she used to be.
Oh yeah, I had the same impression. But yeah, she did really great contributions at the time. Anyway, Robert, for the end, we can now go sort of towards the future after we covered the past. What are your current plans? Are there any possible new plans for some kind of a new book? And I do know that you recently sent your resignation from the position of Director of Research at MUFON. And you can talk a little bit about that and what's there for you now on the horizon.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll start with your last question first.
Yeah.
Yes, I resigned my position as Director of Research at MUFON. I had been in that position for 10 years. I tried to do everything I could for MUFON in the area of science, right, for the scientific investigation of the phenomenon. I created a science review board, which all has hard scientists on it, back in 2012. And we would review the top cases every year and create, a list of top cases for that particular year. But I decided that I have done all I can in terms of, what MUFON needs to do in the area of science. So it's really up to MUFON now to continue moving more towards the field of science. Which I think with the symposium this year, we did not do a good job.
I know what you mean. Yeah.
Yeah. But that's kind of the past. For the future, we had done a report I did with a group of individuals, and we named the group the Scientific Coalition for Ufology. So we hope to continue doing scientific investigations through that organization. And that organization is actually on the web. It's under www.explorescu.org. And so we have more cases that we'll probably put there once we complete an investigation. Most of these investigations are pretty extensive. Currently, I'm working on one. You may be familiar with it. It's a case from November of 2004, and it involved two F-18 Super Hornets from the USS Nimitz. This was off the coast of San Diego. And these guys basically were scrambled by the USS Princeton, which was a missile frigate that had the state-of-the-art radar to an object that they had detected. And when the two pilots got there, what they saw, they described it basically as two white Tic Tacs. You know those little Tic Tacs you eat? They're kind of an oval-shaped object. No wings, no propulsion system, just there in the sky. So I've been doing a series of Freedom of Information requests on that to the Navy and to the Marines, because there were two ships and three unique sets of aircraft that were involved in this incident. So I'll probably publish that under the Scientific Coalition for Ufology once I complete it, which it may be another year before we're done with that investigation.
Oh, that definitely looks like a really impressive case. So ATA is about a year, right? Then you will have sort of a report. Yes.
We should have a report on it next year, I would think.
Great.
Once we're done with all the FOIAs and the appeals of the FOIAs.
Definitely looking forward to that. We could maybe do another show when it is out there, because it's another aeronautical case. I'm also personally interested in those, especially when we have radar detection. And in your case, it seems it was so they had also visual, right?
Right, they had visual and radar. It was detected first by the USS Princeton. Then there was a visual. The two F-18 Super Hornets actually could not make radar. They did not pick it up on their radar, but once they got in the vicinity, they made visual contact. And interestingly, there's a video that went out on the internet, and it, as far as I can tell, it appears to be a legitimate video of the object by the F-18. But we don't have enough specific information yet on that video.
Oh yeah, that's really looks like a really important case. So wow, really good breakdown. I mentioned, I'm not sure, have I saw this on one of mailings lists that we share or somewhere. Is there a sort of a second book in the works or something like that?
Yes, there is. Mike Swords is really pushing for a second book on what we call the phenomenology of UFOs. So this book would discuss more specific cases like CE2s, CE1s, electromagnetic cases. So there is we are doing some work. It has been, it's not even close to being finalized. This time I won't be doing the editing or any of that. I may contribute a chapter or two.
That's great.
But after the amount of work it took on the other book, that's too much of a commitment.
I can bet. And I said in the beginning, I do consider UFOs and the Government the best UFO book ever written. Of course, that is my personal opinion. I'll shortly explain why. Because if somebody comes to me and says, I'm interested in the UFO phenomena, I want to learn more, what would be my first step? And then I would say, you read this book. And that's it. That will be your first step. You have to read it, you have to go through it, and then you will have the most objective overview. You will know the facts, you will know the documents, no speculation, no waste of time, and then you can move further. And that's for me why this is such a groundbreaking work, most important book ever written. And from there you can build up. And it is, you really actually fill the hole that was badly missing in the field. And finally, I consider this, to be honest with you, a masterpiece. And what also Michael Swords did, that was these chapters are actually exciting. They move. You can feel the problem in the government, in the Air Force. So from my perspective, I think I read it in a couple of days. It was so great. So I wanted personally to thank you, Robert, for this work. This is the most important book from my perspective.
Thank you very much for that compliment. And I have to give much of that credit to Michael Swords.
Yes, but definitely it was a teamwork and everybody contributed. But yeah, what Michael did with the chapters, that was really, really amazing. And I do know that Robert Zemeckis they are now producing some kind of series of the Project Blue Book. Has anyone from your team maybe been contacted about that? Do you maybe know? Or
no, I'm not even aware of that movie.
I think it will be a TV series. It was announced, and I think there was also the name of the screenplay writer that was mentioned. And I was just thinking what sources he will use. But then you were not contacted. That's unfortunate. But I'm also I'm looking forward to see how it will look, because the last one, what was the name? Project UFO or something like that in the series in the 70s, something like that.
Oh, yeah. Back in the 60s. Yeah, I remember that. I can't recall.
Me too. Yeah. But we'll see. We'll see how it will look. But anyway, okay, Robert, I want to thank you once again for being guest in the show. I really respect your work, following you for years. I really like your approach, and you are based on facts, really deep investigations. The less speculations, the better. Like I was interviewing the pilot Peter Marr in the previous episode, and he told me something that really stayed with me when he said, these are the facts and the rest is speculation, and I have to leave it to that. So I like it so much. Yeah. But anyway, thank you so much, Robert, again. Let's stay in touch, and if you will have anything in the future, I would always like to promote your work. Thanks so much for being guest in the show.
Well, thank you, Giuliano.